We have a shocker for you today. You know, I didn't know what this critical race theory was. I asked our producer, will you please tell me what this thing is? Well, critical race theory is now invading every corner of American society. So what is it exactly? And why have many states already banned it? And how is this weaponization of race becoming a dangerous threat to our freedom? Dale Hurd explains.
Parents across the country are surprised and angry that critical race theory is being taught to their public school children, often without any discussion, and a growing number want it stopped.
CRT is racist, it is abusive, it discriminates against one's color.
Schools are trying to poison our children's minds, teaching them about things that they have no right to be taught in school.
While some parents support the teaching of critical race theory.
My name is Robin Scott. My pronouns are she, her. I'm here today as an LCPS parent and former student, not only in support of our school board's effort to improve equity, but to speak directly to our community, asking to stop turning equality into a weapon.
But a new poll shows that most Americans oppose critical race theory, and at least 22 states have either introduced legislation to ban it or have already banned it altogether.
It's offensive to the taxpayer that they would be asked to fund critical race theory, that they would be asked to fund teaching kids to hate their country and to hate each other.
Critical race theory says racism exists everywhere and that whites will always be racist.
So I put this up because I really want any white person in the room to know up front that this is what we're dealing with.
In his new book, Fault Lines, Pastor Vodi Balcom calls critical race theory a cult.
It has its own cosmology. It has its own saints. You know, it has its own law. What it doesn't have is a gospel, because there is no grace in anti-racism. There is no forgiveness. There is no restoration.
CRT is spread quickly from academia to corporate America, the military, and even churches. But opposition to it is growing. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Well, here's the story. Critical race theory is an analytical framework to analyze institutions and culture. Its purpose is to divide the world into white oppressors and non-white victims. Instead of traditional forms of knowledge, it holds up personal narratives of marginalized minority victim groups, blacks, Hispanics, and Asians, as evidence considered irrefutably by the nature of the dishonesty of their mostly white heterosexual oppressors. The ultimate goal of this theory's proponents is to remake society so that the victim class eventually displaces the oppressors and becomes the new ruling class. Within this framework, white privilege and its unearned benefits become responsible for economic, health, and social disparities in minority communities. This system of thought advances a narrative of blame that blames white American guilty for the plight of blacks. And when it comes to education, members of the victim classes are to do all teaching. It is a worldview and narrative that commands white people to sit in obedience and listen quietly to arguments about their unjust gains, as well as their obligations to provide a remedy for them. In this case, to black Americans, whether they are descended from slaves or not. There is no way out for whites when it comes to race-critical theory, which assumes that racism is permanent and affects every aspect of society, including politically, economic, social, and religious institutions. The theory further advances the belief that being born with white skin itself confers unearned benefits. Therefore, any societal attainment of color blindness, which in race or ethnicity does not hinder opportunities, is impossible. Neutrality in law and decision-making is a pipe dream that can never be attained. Therefore, this reasoning goes, the oppressive system must be dismantled and destroyed. The flawed theory suggests that race and ethnicity will always taint and pollute every decision, and as a result, racial minorities will consistently lose out to whites because of structural racism. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is what they believe. You say, I didn't believe it. It's horrible. That's being taught in the schools. It's being introduced into our military. It is pervasive in our society. It is absolute occult. It is absolute nonsense. Now, with us now is Dr. Carol Swain. She wrote these words I just read. She's been a professor at Vanderbilt University and an associate professor at Princeton. She's an author, public speaker, and political commentator. She's written and spoken about critical race theory, and Dr. Swain, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the 700 Club. Can I ask you one question? Why, after the Emancipation Proclamation, the end of the Civil War, the end of slavery, why is this critical race theory now coming to the fore?
Well, I mean, there's a political advantage to keeping people divided by race. And I can tell you that I see it as the civil rights issue of our time. And it does involve discrimination against whites, but it harms minorities as well. Because if you're told that you are a permanent victim and that no matter what you do, you're still going to be a victim because white people are privileged and that white people control your fate, I mean, that is not something that would inspire people to improve their lives. It's a very depressing, disheartening message, and it is setting us back, like in race relations. We were making progress. We are going backwards, and I know that, you know, America has been good to me. I love my country. I was able to thrive through the equal opportunities that were offered me after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Well, the message now is that it doesn't matter. Everything is about race.
Doctor, is there any way out for white people under this critical race theory?
Well, I think that, for one thing, critical race theory is white supremacy, but because it argues that white people have a property interest in their whiteness, that is property, and it argues that only white people can rescue people of color. At the same time, it's saying that racism is permanent. I think that white people need to push back because it runs counter to our Constitution's Equal Protection Clause, all the civil rights laws. White people are protected by the 1964 Civil Rights Act and many state and local laws. And it's not who we are as Americans, in the sense that in America, we are a nation where the people know that it's not acceptable to shame or bully people because of the color of their skin. If it applies to racial and ethnic minorities, it also applies to white people, and it has no place in the church. And what I find is that a lot of pastors are being deceived and manipulated. They all are guilt-ridden if they're white, and they're going along with it, and they're giving deference to Black pastors and Black churches who are, for the most part, Democrats pushing a Democratic agenda because critical race theory has taken over the Democratic Party, and that's not good for our society.
Doctor, how widespread now is this critical race theory? Is it really widespread?
Well, Sesame Street, Nickelodeon, they are indoctrinating kids, and you may have heard about the research now that they argue that babies are racist by 6 months. And so they want parents to intervene to teach their children to be anti-racist, and they do this by making them conscious of race. And so the days, you know, when you grew up and you had a best friend and you loved your best friend and you didn't notice your best friend's race, I mean, that's how most of us grew up. Now they want you to notice race first. And I think this can go horribly wrong, because if you notice race first and you don't get to know individuals, if you have an unpleasant experience as a child with someone from a different race or ethnicity, you're more likely to characterize that whole group based on your experience with one person. When we saw each other as individuals, that was less likely to happen.
This is going to tear America apart, won't it? I mean, that's really, I guess, the game of the people putting it out.
That's the intent, and it saddens me. I'm very disheartened by the fact that not enough people are standing up and pushing back. I also believe, Pat, that racial and ethnic minorities need to take a leadership role. When we fought the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, that was a coalition of people from different races and ethnicities. And I find that many white people in America, they have been shamed to the point that they've lost their voices. They won't stand up for principles. And I think racial and ethnic minorities like me have to stand up and lead this civil rights movement, because this is a civil rights movement and it will destroy our country. No good can come from critical race theory. And for those people that are foolish enough to argue that critical race theory will lead to racial reconciliation, they've lost their minds. Critical race theory cannot reconcile anyone, because it is based on division and it has no place in the church.
Well, Doctor, thank you so much for being with us. Dr. Carol Swain, a very distinguished academic and writer. And ladies and gentlemen, if you're like me, you really didn't know too much about it. Now you know. Now we've got to say something. We cannot allow this nonsense to be perpetrated in our schools, and have little children at 3 years old or 2 years old or 3 months old being taught that somehow they are either an oppressed minority or they are a racial oppressor. It is an outrageous thing, but it is being taught.